I left on a Thursday morning in March with one suitcase, $43 in my wallet, and the specific, clarifying calm of someone who has finally made a decision they should have made 2 years earlier. No argument, no dramatic door slam, no final, devastating speech that landed the way it deserved to land. I just carried my suitcase down the stairs of the house I had grown up in, past the wall of family photos where my brother's face appeared in 17 frames and mine appeared in 4, and walked out the front door into a morning that was cold enough to see my own breath. And I kept walking until the house was out of sight and I could finally exhale all the way for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember. My parents didn't come to the door. My brother, I learned later, slept through it entirely. 7 years later, on a Tuesday evening when I was sitting in an apartment that was mine, in a city that had chosen me back after I chose it first, my phone rang and it was my mother. And the first thing she said was not hello. It was, "We need you." And I sat with those 3 words for a long time before I said anything back. Because 3 words that small were somehow being asked to carry the weight of 7 years. And I needed to find out if they were strong enough before I decided what to do with them. Stay with me, because what I said when I finally responded, and what happened in the months that followed that phone call, is the most honest thing I know how to tell you about what family costs and what it's worth, and how you find out the difference between those 2 numbers. If you've ever left the people who were supposed to love you most because staying was making you disappear, subscribe right now, because this story knows exactly where you've been and exactly where it's possible to go from there. I need to take you back before the suitcase, before the $43, before the cold March morning, because leaving doesn't make sense without the years that made leaving the only remaining option. I was the second child in a family that operated, structurally, as though second children were a kind of rough draft, necessary to the existence of the final version, but not themselves the point. My brother Daniel was 3 years older, and from the time I was old enough to understand the geography of my own family, I understood that Daniel occupied the center of it in a way that left specific, predictable shapes of absence around everyone else. He was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story requires a villain, and my brother was never quite that. Just a person who had been handed so much for so long that he had lost the ability to see what the giving was costing the people around him, which is a different kind of damage than cruelty, but not a less real one. My parents were not monsters either. My father was a man who loved his children in the specific, limited way of someone who had been taught that love was expressed through provision and loyalty, and Daniel was the child who most clearly needed both of those things, in the forms my father knew how to provide them. My mother was a woman who had made Daniel her project in the way certain mothers make their firstborns their projects, completely, irrevocably, with the full weight of her identity tied to his outcomes in a way that left her genuinely unable to see, most of the time, what the architecture of her attention was doing to the child who existed outside its center. She loved me. I have never doubted that she loved me. But love that can't see you clearly, enough to know what you actually need, isn't equipped to give you what it intends to give. And for 23 years of living inside that blind spot, I had been slowly, quietly disappearing into the space between who I actually was and who it was convenient for my family to believe I was. The specific incident that made Thursday morning inevitable happened 6 weeks before I left, and it was not large enough on the surface to justify what followed, which is how I know it wasn't actually about the incident at all. It was about the accumulated weight of every incident before it. And this one just happened to be the one that finally told me the truth about how long I had been carrying something I was never going to be able to put down as long as I stayed in the same house as the people who kept adding to it. My father's business, a small construction contracting firm he had run for 30 years, was in serious financial trouble, 2 bad contracts in a row, a cash flow problem that had been quietly worsening for over a year, and a decision point that required someone to take on a significant operational role to stabilize things before they became unsalvageable. I had a business degree. I had 2 years of financial management experience at a firm that had specifically trained me in small business turnaround. My father knew this. My mother knew this. They offered the role to Daniel. Daniel, who had spent the previous 4 years working inconsistently across 3 different jobs he'd never stayed in longer than 14 months, who had no financial management training, who was currently in the middle of a personal situation that was consuming most of his attention and energy. They offered it to Daniel, sat down with him for 3 evenings in a row to walk through the details, and mentioned it to me as a footnote, almost in passing, when my mother called to ask if I could help Daniel understand some of the financial documents because some of the terminology was confusing him. Not, we'd like your help. Not, we think you might be better suited for this. Just, can you explain some terminology to your brother? Because he's going to be running things and he's finding some of the language a little technical. I helped Daniel with the terminology. I sat with him for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon and walked him through every document he needed to understand, and I did it without saying any of the things that were filling the room between us like pressure without a release valve. Because Daniel had always known, the way children who are loved most know without ever being told, that he was the one who was chosen, and I had always known, the way children who are loved second know without ever being told, that pointing this out would only result in being told I was wrong, which is its own specific category of devastation. I helped him with the documents, and I went home and I sat with myself for 6 weeks, and then I packed 1 suitcase, and I walked out on a Thursday morning in March with $43 and the decision to stop auditing my own worth against the only rubric I had ever been given for measuring it. If you've ever loved people who couldn't see you and left not because you stopped loving them, but because staying was making you stop being able to see yourself, comment the walk below, because that morning is the most important thing I ever did for myself. And I need you to understand the weight of it before I show you what it eventually made possible. The first year away was the hardest, and I am not going to sanitize that for you, because I think the sanitized version of stories like this does a disservice to everyone who is currently in the middle of the hard year and needs to know that the difficulty is not evidence that they made the wrong choice. I moved to a city 4 hours from home with a contact from a college friend who knew someone who had a spare room, and I slept in that spare room for 3 months while I found work, first a temporary administrative position, then a junior financial analyst role at a small firm whose senior partner saw something in an interview that he described later as an unusual combination of technical skill and the particular adaptability of someone who has been solving problems under pressure for a long time with fewer resources than they needed. He wasn't wrong. I had been doing exactly that my entire life. I just hadn't been doing it in a context that recognized it as skill until I left the context that mistook it for baseline functioning. I didn't call home for 4 months. My mother called twice during that period. Both times on Sundays, both times in the careful, surface-maintaining voice she used for conversations she wanted to have, without having them, the voice that reported on events without acknowledging anything underneath them. She told me about Daniel's progress with the business, about my father's health, about a neighbor's renovation, and at the end of both calls, she said, "We miss you," in a tone that was technically true and practically insufficient. And I said I was fine. And we hung up, and I sat with the phone in my hand, afterward doing the arithmetic of what had just been exchanged and finding it, as always, several values short of what I actually needed from it. After the 4th month, I stopped, waiting for the calls to become something different, and started simply building the life that was available to me in their absence. This is the part of the story I want to spend some time with, because I think it's the part that gets compressed most unfairly in stories about people who leave difficult families, the long, unglamorous, genuinely good middle section where you discover, with recurring surprise, what it feels like to live inside your own actual life instead of a supporting role in someone else's. I made friends who knew me only as I was, with no family mythology preceding me, no older brother's reputation I was perpetually adjacent to, no parental expectations I was perpetually falling short of. I was just myself in the raw, provisional, occasionally uncertain way of someone who is building an identity from materials they chose themselves, and that freedom was terrifying and also the most alive I had felt in longer than I could trace. My work grew. Within 2 years at the firm, I had taken on enough responsibility that my senior partner began including me in client meetings I hadn't expected to enter for another 3 years. By year 3, I was managing a portfolio of small business clients doing exactly the kind of financial turnaround work I had been positioned to do for my father's business while my family was asking me to explain terminology to my brother. By year 4, I had enough of a professional reputation in the city to move to a larger firm with more scope, a better team, and the kind of work that kept me interested enough to forget, for full days at a time, the version of myself I had left behind in a house with $43 and one suitcase. I heard about my father's business intermittently, through the kind of second-hand information that leaks through extended family even when you aren't actively seeking it. Daniel had not ultimately been able to stabilize things. My mother's occasional Sunday calls, which had continued at their polished, surface-level frequency, began to carry a new quality in year 3, a slight, controlled tension underneath the reportage, the auditory equivalent of someone keeping their voice very steady because if they let it move at all, it might move somewhere. They aren't ready to go. I noticed it and said nothing because I had learned, across 3 years of my own quiet rebuilding, that some information needs to be offered rather than extracted, and that the decision about when to offer it belonged to the people who were holding it, not to me. Then year 7 arrived, and a Tuesday evening in October, and my phone rang, and it was my mother, and she said, "We need you." 3 words, the weight of 7 years underneath them. And before I tell you what I said, I need to tell you what those 3 words actually meant in the specific language of my specific family, because understanding that translation is the entire emotional architecture of everything that followed. "We need you" in my family's language had always meant, "We need what you can do." It had never, not once in my memory, preceded a sentence that continued with who you actually are, or what you have been building, or how you have been, genuinely, in the years since you walked out of our lives on a cold Thursday morning with $43 and we did not come to the door. "We need you" had always been, in my family's economy of emotional expression, a practical sentence, a request for function, dressed in the language of belonging. And I sat with it for long, enough on that Tuesday evening to decide whether I was going to respond to the word "we" or to the word "need," because those were 2 genuinely different responses, and only one of them was going to tell the truth about what I actually had available to give. I said, "Tell me what's happening, all of it, not the version that's easier to say, the real version." And my mother was quiet for long enough that I thought she might redirect, might smooth it back to the surface, the way she smoothed everything back to the surface. And then she didn't. She told me, in a voice I had never heard from her before, stripped of its usual management, rough at the edges with something that was either exhaustion or honesty or both, simultaneously, that my father's business had effectively collapsed 6 months earlier, that Daniel had left his operational role after 14 months, consistent with every other role he had ever held, and that the departure had accelerated the collapse in ways that were now legally complicated and financially serious, that my father had been too proud to reach out earlier, and my mother had spent 6 months trying to manage the situation with resources she didn't have and knowledge she had never needed to acquire, that they were at a point where without someone who understood small business financial restructuring, they were looking at outcomes my father had spent 30 years of his life working specifically to avoid. She told me all of it. And then she said at the end, something that was not part of the business situation and was not a request and was not dressed in any of the diplomatic language she had spent a lifetime using to keep difficult feelings at a safe navigable distance. She said, "I know we didn't see you the way we should have. I have known that for longer than I've been willing to say it out loud. Your father knows it too, in the way your father knows things, privately, and with great difficulty, and without the right words for it yet. But I'm saying it now because I think you deserve to hear it before you decide whether to help. And not as a reason for you to help, but just because it's true and it should have been said a long time before tonight. I want you to sit inside that moment with me, because it was the most unexpected thing that had ever happened in my relationship with my mother, and I was not prepared for it. And the not being prepared for it was important. It meant I couldn't respond from a prepared position, couldn't manage my reaction the way I had learned to manage reactions in that family from earliest memory. I just sat with it and felt it land the way truth lands. When it finally arrives, after a long enough journey that you'd half stopped expecting it, not like victory, not like vindication, but like a door opening in a wall you had stopped believing had a door in it. I flew home the following weekend, not to fix the business immediately, to see my father, who met me at the door of a house that looked smaller than I remembered, in the specific way that the physical containers of our childhood always look smaller once we have grown large, enough outside of them, to see their actual dimensions. He shook my hand. My father had never been a man who hugged easily, and the handshake was the fullest version of the greeting he had available. And I took it for what it was, the entire vocabulary of a man using every word he had. My mother made dinner, the specific meal she had made for every significant family occasion since I was small, and we sat at a table that had one conspicuous absence, because Daniel was not there, and nobody acknowledged the absence directly, which told me that the absence was not accidental. We talked for 3 hours after dinner. Not the surface talk, not the call frequency level of discourse, real talk. The kind that requires something from everyone at the table and leaves everyone slightly more exposed than they were comfortable being going in. My father, with great effort and long pauses and the occasional retreat into safer territory before returning, told me things about his own life, his own history with his own father, his own understanding of what he had done right and what he had done in ways he now wished he could revise, that I had never heard from him in 30 years of being his child. My mother listened to him say these things without smoothing them, without redirecting to something easier, and I understood that this was itself a significant change, that the version of my mother sitting at that table had made some decision, at some point during those 7 years, to stop performing competence at the expense of honesty. I spent 2 weeks working through my father's financial situation with the full weight of everything I had spent 7 years building. I restructured the debt. I negotiated with 2 creditors who had legitimate claims and one who was leveraging a technicality I was able to challenge successfully. I identified the portions of the business that were salvageable and the portions that needed to be released. And I put together a reorganization plan that gave my father, if he chose to implement it, a viable path forward, smaller than what he'd built, but real and his, and free of the complications that had been accumulating since Daniel's departure. I did this not because I owed it to them, and not as payment for my mother's honesty at that dinner table, but because it was the work I was genuinely good at, and because somewhere in those 2 weeks I had arrived at a conclusion that felt like the most adult thing I had ever understood about love. That doing something for people who hurt you, from a position of genuine choice rather than obligation, is one of the ways you demonstrate to yourself that they no longer have the power to determine your worth. The help I gave my father was mine to give or withhold, and I gave it freely, and that freedom was the point. Daniel called while I was there, on a Wednesday afternoon, and I picked up, because I had also arrived, in 7 years, at the understanding that my brother's being chosen over me was not something he had engineered. It was something that had been done to both of us, by parents who were doing the best they could with what they understood, and that what it had cost me was real, but what it had cost him, in a different direction, was also real, even if I had spent years being unable to see the second cost because I was too busy carrying the first. We talked for 40 minutes. It was awkward and incomplete and more honest than any conversation we had managed in the previous decade, and it ended with an agreement to talk again, which is not resolution but is something, and something was more than I had left with 7 years earlier. I flew back to my city on a Sunday and landed in the late afternoon, and took a cab to my apartment and stood in it for a moment before turning on the lights, just standing in the dark in the place I had built for myself, with the particular quality of feeling that comes after you have done something that cost you something, real, and found that the cost was worth paying. My apartment was the same as I'd left it. My work was the same. My life in that city was entirely intact, exactly as I had built it.